Good evening. Welcome to this special book launch. We are delighted to be able to continue organizing literary events in spite of the circumstances.
I am Silvia Alfaro, director of Mapale Publishing House. Since 2004, we have been publishing the work of Latin Canadian writers. However, our portfolio includes some books of writers from other nationalities. Our purpose all these years has been to promote the Spanish language, our culture, our literature, and to help writers to publish their books in Spanish in Canada. We are very proud to be a Latin Canadian publisher that specializes in publishing writers' first books. So we have been able to open an important door for them. As you can imagine, we took probably the most difficult path. So COVID-19 is no more difficult for us than many other things we have faced over the last 16 years. And actually, this pandemic has had a silver lining in many ways because it forced us to have virtual events so that people from anywhere in the world who are interested and have access to internet can join us. And this is very, very beautiful. So thank you very much to all of you that are here with us. And thanks to those that are following the event on Facebook. Today, we are presenting the novel, The Unending Journey by José Del Pozo. We published the Spanish original novel last year under the title El viaje interminable. Everything with José Del Pozo has been very special. And I am very happy with this experience. First, when I read the manuscript, I like it very much because for me it was more than a novel. For me it was an important story based in real events, real people that were forced to emigrate because of the circumstances in their birth countries. And it was a universal story. Of course, it was about exile Chileans, but it could apply to exile from any other country. I learned a lot, and in a way, I developed a sense of solidarity, understanding, and compassion for so many people. So reading this book was a gift for me. And I understood much better many people I had met since I came to Canada 24 years ago. I immigrated for different reasons, and I have not had some of the experiences other immigrants have had to go through. However, since I decided to promote Latin Canadian artists, writers, and musicians, I became very involved with the Latin community, and I saw many things that at first I didn't understand completely. So with this novel, I was not only clarifying many aspects of the history of the last 60 years in Chile and Canada, but also getting to better understand people that I already knew. I'm sure all of you have heard this saying that reading makes you a better person. I have to say that this is another book in my list that has contributed to making me a better person. I have never said this to Jose or to anybody, so now you all know. Another aspect of this book that I like is that it is clear and easy to read. The Spanish original is therefore good for people that have Spanish as their second language. So this is very important in Canada. And also, this novel was José Del Pozo's first novel. Of course, he's the author of several books and articles in academic journals in Canada, France, and Chile. He's a history professor and writer. He was born in Chile and has lived in Montreal since 1974. Jose was a professor of Latin American history for 40 years at the University of Quebec in Montreal, and he retired in 2014. Because of his profession, this novel has the characteristics I just described, and that's why these aspects were key for the translation. Why or how? Well, I met Ian Thomas Shaw many years ago. Ian is a Canadian novelist, translator, and diplomat. He was born in Vancouver and has lived for many years in Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. He now lives in Elmer, Quebec, that is very close to Ottawa, where I live. And we have met many times in the monthly meetings of the Ottawa Independent Writers. And at one point, we were talking about the possibility of publishing one of his novels in translation into Spanish. We also talked about collaborations. So one day we met to discuss all these things, and I told him how grateful I was for his efforts and interest in helping Mapale. That day, I gave him El Viaje Interminable, which we had just recently published. A few days after, he called me to say that he was interested in translating this novel. He gave me a very good offer, so I had to say yes immediately before he changed his mind. And this is how we were able to publish The Unending Journey. So thank you very much, Ian. Finally, I would like to introduce you to our moderator, Beatriz Hausner. Beatriz has published several poetry collections. Her books have been published internationally and translated into several languages, including into her native Spanish, French, and Greek. Beatriz is a respected historian and translator of Latin American surrealism, with recent essays published in the International Encyclopedia of Surrealism in 2019. She was chair of the Public Lending Right Commission and was president of the Literary Translators Association of Canada. So, Beatriz, it's an honor to have you moderating this important conversation. Thank you, and now the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Silvia. This is a wonderful introduction. It's really my pleasure to be participating in this wonderful launch because it was such a wonderful read, this book. You know, I'm not much of a fiction reader these days. I read a lot of nonfiction and poetry, and I found this book to be so rich and deep in not just in historical terms, but in its scope. You know, because it's able to very compactly take us into a time, a long time actually, a trajectory that gives us a lot of insight, not only into the experience of exile in Canada and in Montreal specifically, but also what came before, you know, because one of the important concepts that sometimes escapes people is the fact that the people who come to Canada from other places, whether as refugees or immigrants or, you know, willingly or not, don't come here as empty vessels that are filled with Canadian experience. You know, they come with a whole cultural kind of, let's call it baggage, but it really in a very positive way. It's an important story that each person brings, and it's a very important story that can be told sometimes very well, but by a good writer like José Del Pozo. So it is really my pleasure. I think that it's an important book, and that it's a book that could really enrich Canadian literature, and as you know, as it should. So without more ado, I'm going to get going right away, and we're going to pass the floor to the two authors of this book in English translation, José Del Pozo and the translator Ian Thomas Shaw. So the first question is for José. José, The Unending Journey is a story of exile primarily, of the internal shift that takes place when a person is uprooted physically and emotionally from their space and from the identity they recognized as fully theirs. Can you comment on this, on my statement?
Well, thank you very much for what you said about me, and thank you, Silvia, for what you said also about my book. To comment on the question, Beatriz, question, I would say that, of course, living his or her country and being forced to do it, it is something that causes a hard and often painful experience. But I did not want to express that only in political terms, even if my characters have a political standing, and that appears in the book. But I also wanted to touch the more personal aspects, the nostalgia that all exiles felt, all the different things that they miss when arriving in a new country, the weather, of course, but also the landscape, the lack of mountains, very important for Chileans, the lack of the Cordillera de los Andes, which is a reference so important for us, being separated from the family, the daily life, and to accept a new identity. That is a big issue. That appears when Marcos, the main character, after several years in Montreal, leaves his wife and starts a relationship with Danielle, a Quebec woman who is very much in favor of Quebec independence. Marcos is willing to vote in favor of this option in the referendum in 1995, but he's not able to define himself as Quebecer after 20 years in his new country. He feels always as a Chilean living in Quebec. And also about identity, I think that the character of Gabriela, Marcos' wife, is interesting because she is not involved in politics. She did not want to leave Chile, and she did it only to support her husband, and because she thought that they would come back in a couple of years. But after the first month in Montreal, she starts to change her attitude, even if she misses her family, because she finds a job and starts a new career that will be very successful. And she enjoys the fact of becoming an independent woman and to discover that she's able to do many things that she didn't do in Chile. And that is why and it is she who pushes Marcos to buy a house in Montreal and to stay in Canada. And she doesn't think about going back to Chile. So that Gabriela represents a kind of woman that is not political one, but she lives a new life here and she enjoys that. And finally, I would like about identity, the condition of exile. I came to the conclusion that there are several levels of exile. In the memoirs and different books about the subject, I always find that exiles feel desperately the need to going back to their country. And the political involvement is tremendously important. But my characters, which are inspired by my Montreal experience, are not exactly like that. They are worried about what's going on in Chile, but they want to develop their own lives in Canada. They think about themselves also, and they don't come back to Chile. They decide to stay in Canada. So that's another, I would say, kind of exile.
That is, I think, a fairly common experience, but the assumption of exile is not always as clear for everybody, right? Especially for Chileans who have such a deep nostalgia for the space that they inhabit in Chile. I mean, Chile is such a special country, and it's always been so far away from everything else in the world. And
yes.
And as you say, the mountains are so preponderant that they define everything. And seeing all this flatness of the landscape in Eastern Canada, it's extremely strange, right? It's a feeling of strangeness for sure. And I think you express that very clearly in the book. In a way, the characters do feel like they're out of their space a lot of the time, even as they assume a life of real participants in Quebec society. It's very interesting. So the next question is for Ian. Ian, tell us a little bit about how you came to translate El Viaje Interminable, and tell us a little bit about the translation process, or how it worked for you. How did it evolve in the case of this book in particular?
Silvia explained that, you know, I've known her for a long time. I used to be the president of the Ottawa Independent Writers, and also was the chair of the Prose in the Park Literary Festival of 3 years, and Silvia was there. So when Silvia gave me the book, and she seemed very proud of the book, the Spanish edition, of course, you know, I had to read it, you know. I hadn't read Spanish for a long time, and I got into it, and I found that José's Spanish, it's written in Spanish, is very accessible. Like Silvia said, for someone who's a non-native speaker, it's actually a very good book to read. Although there are Chilean expressions that most people would not understand, maybe even some Spanish speakers wouldn't understand initially. So as I read the book, what I thought of was my years when I lived in Montreal. And I lived many years in the 80s and the 70s in Montreal. And I was a bit of an activist at the time for the Palestinians, because I had lived in the Middle East for quite a while, and with the war in Lebanon. So we used to organize demonstrations. So who came to our demonstrations? Well, of course, the Lebanese, the Palestinians, the Quebecois, and the Chileans came. Many, many Chileans turned out in solidarity. And so I got to know a few in those days. And they were recent refugees to Canada. They'd been there 3, 4, 5 years. But I didn't really know them that well. But in reading José's book, I felt I got to know these people that were just acquaintances 20 or 30 years ago. And it was very pleasant to read the book and to understand what the human story was behind a movement of refugees from Latin America into Canada. And so that's why I like the book. And I said to Silvia, you know, I'll translate the book, you know, I'll take a small fee for it, something you can afford. And it would be good practice for my translating into Spanish into English. You were asking about the process of translation, I believe. So I translate at work all the time between English and French, because I work in Global Affairs Canada. And I'm also a big believer in using the internet and technology as much as possible to speed up the translation process. So I will say something that some literary translators will find shocking, but I do often with the first draft, I do use machine language type of translations to get it going, to compare the two. And I try to process to see how fast you could translate to speed up the process. Interestingly, I found that machine language translation from Spanish into English doesn't really work that well. It's one of those languages, because of the lack of pronouns and everything, where really you have to sit down and go through it again and again, and you can't really rely too much on it. But what the internet is good for also is Chilean slang. There's many Chilean expressions in José's book, and I had to search the internet to find them. And then, of course, at the end, once we had done a draft, José took a look at it and he went through it to make sure that I got everything right. So my process was, you know, using my own knowledge of Spanish, being motivated by the book, because I think that's important for a translator. You cannot be just a technician. You have to feel the book, and then using technology as much as possible to speed up the process. So that's how I've been working. And I have another translation coming out with Guernica Editions from French into English. It's not as long, it's by a Quebec author. So, and now I'm working on co-translations of German and English into German. And actually, I'm working on another co-translation from Catalan into English. I'm playing around with translation. I find it very fascinating, very stimulating.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. So what we're going to do now to sort of break up a little bit and to introduce people to the actual book is we're going to ask José and Ian to read briefly from the book. So José is going to read a bit of the Spanish, and Ian will read the same passage in English. So Jose, you go first.
Very well. Well, I'm going to read the last part of the first chapter in which I give the story of Marcos and Gabriela when they lived in Chile. En cuanto a mí, cuando lo pienso retrospectivamente, fue sin duda la jornada más trascendente de mi vida, más que el día de mi matrimonio o cuando nació Loreto, mi hija. Partir a Canadá era un salto al vacío, a lo desconocido, irse a un lugar donde nadie nos esperaba y en el cual había que partir de cero. Por primera vez en mi vida sentía que no tendría ningún control sobre lo que nos podría ocurrir. Era emprender la fuga, una decisión dictada no por la razón, sino por el rechazo visceral que experimentaba contra todo lo que estaba sucediendo en Chile. Lo único que quería era partir, dejar todo atrás por un buen periodo de tiempo, sin pensar en lo que nos podía ocurrir de aquí en adelante. Era el inicio de un viaje cuyo término nadie podía precisar.
Ian, it's your turn now.
I'm going to read the translation into English of the same passage. When I think about it, it was undoubtedly the most important day of my life, more than the day of my marriage or when Loreto was born. Leaving for Canada was a leap into the void, into the unknown, into a place where no one was expecting us and where we would have to start from scratch. For the first time in my life, I felt I would have no control of what could happen to us. It was a decision dictated not by reason, but by the visceral rejection I felt against everything that was happening in Chile. The only thing I wanted was to leave everything behind for a good period of time without thinking about what could happen to us from that point on. It was the beginning of a journey whose end no one could foresee.
Okay, great, thanks. I have a question for Silvia. Is how has COVID affected Mapale in particular?
Yes, COVID-19 has been really hard for most of the people. And for Mapale, it's interesting because for us, always has been difficult because we publish in Spanish mainly. In Canada, the official languages are English and French. So always has been really difficult. We rely a lot in events with the community, and people like to get together, and we organize many events. And in those events, we can promote better the books, and people buy because people like to meet the authors and talk with them and have this, to sign the book. So right now we can't do any of these things. But the good part is that we can have these events, that we can reach so many people. However, selling the book has been more difficult. And so far we had like 11 events online, and many people have been participating in some 50, 60. The first one, actually, we had 100 and many people waiting, but the sales are very low. So I see the difference between the events when we are with the author and the people in person and this one.
So, since you will rely to sell the books online, tell us where to buy the book. How can we get a copy of the book?
Yeah, with the publishing house that is in www.artemapale.com or in Amazon. We will have the ebook. That is something that now with the pandemic, we are pushing more. People can buy both versions.
Okay, thank you very much, Silvia. So everybody who's at the launch at this time, take note. All right, so Jose, the second question, and then after this question period, we're going to open it up to all of you to ask your questions. You are a very respected historian, and it's true that, I mean, for me, the experience of reading your book is very rich because there's so much depth of history in the book itself. Tell me, how do you see the relationship between history and fiction, especially when you were writing the book? I'm very interested in that, and I think the audience will be too.
Well, since you raised this question about myself as a historian, I'm going to take just a minute to explain how this novel was born. Because at the beginning, I was thinking on writing my memoir, with memorias. But I realized soon that my real life is not that interesting. And that if I had written such a book, that would have been interesting only for my mother, who is still alive at 99 years old, my wife, perhaps my son, some nephews, but not much more, no much more than that. So that I decided to use fiction, which allows me to lie a little bit, as Mario Vargas Llosa said once. Is fiction the art of lying? And I started lying when I invented a completely different wife, because Gabriela, Marcos is the main character, and Marcos is myself, because the novel is very much based on my own experience, my own biography. And Marcos' wife, Gabriela, is completely different from mine. And I also created a daughter, which I never had. I have a son in the real life, and so on. And then to answer directly to your question, the interrelation between history and fiction. Well, I think it is a tricky issue, because being historian could bring me to insist too much in the historical information, to the detriment of the characters. And that I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to make this novel a kind of history of the Chilean immigration, because that I have already done it in a history book. Of course, there are historical facts, since the book covers 50 years of history. I started the story when Marcos and Gabriela were young students at the Universidad de Chile in Santiago in the 1960s. And then the story covers the period of the dictatorship, historical events in Canada and Quebec, the two referendums on the Quebec independence in 1980 and 1995, the transition to democracy in Chile, and the recent period when Marcos goes often and often to Chile, but he's not sure whether he wants to come back to Chile or whether he wants to stay in Canada. So that there is that historical information, but I insist that it is a novel, and the main center is not the political standing of the characters, it's not the history, but the private life. How Marcos and his friends, Chileans and Quebecers, feel the relationship between people of that place and people coming from outside, and how they adapt or don't adapt to the new country. And I think that the case of Loreto, Marcos and Gabriela's daughter, is interesting because she arrives in Montreal as a child. And throughout the book, she lives the same historical events, the same that his parents' life, but in another way, not as in their political meaning. So that readers can read the book, I think, in two different ways. One is to follow the story as a historical information and learn a lot, as many people have told me, learn a lot about Chilean history, the dictatorship, the military coup. And then the other way is to see how immigrants or exiles feel when they arrive in a new country. And in that sense, if you take the second one, I think that this story can be identified to the story of many people, not just from Chile, but from other countries. And I hope also that the book will be useful to Quebecers who can see how other people see them, and how the other people coming to Quebec and to Canada adapt or not in the new country. So that those were my goals when I wrote this story. then it's not my biography, it's not my real life. There are some real things, but there are others who are completely fictional.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, thank you. Yes, I think that comes very clear. It's very interesting how you create the character of the daughter, because the daughter is very connected to the Chilean experience, which is not always the case for immigrants. You know, a lot of second generation immigrants are or immigrant children adapt to the country that they came to, and
But
the
may I say something on that
yes,
point, specific
please.
point?
Yeah.
But there is one very interesting thing, I think, about Loreto. She likes to speak Spanish and to socialize with Chileans, but she doesn't want to come back to Chile.
Right.
Because she tells her parents, I like Chileans, but the Chileans in Montreal, not the Chileans who live in Chile. Because
True.
their way of life, it's not mine.
Absolutely, it's true. It's true. So I'm going to ask Ian one more question. Ian, you yourself are a fiction writer, and as I think we discussed briefly, translators, literary translators, are very interested in the notion of authorship. At least many of us are. Some of us are even online now. And so I wanted to ask you how you see, as an author of fiction, original fiction, and as a translator, how do you see the role of the author or the translator as author? I mean, you know, you can use it as a starting point or argue against what I'm saying, or it's up to you.
So, you know, Beatriz, you know, you gave me a heads up on this question. I guess it's quite normal for moderators to do that. And I had to really think about it, you know, because when I translate Jose's book, you know, I give him full credit. You know, Jose is the author. He is the creator of that story. And I enjoyed the story. And I thought my job was really to interpret it as best as possible for English-speaking audience, so they could also appreciate it, you know, in translation. And I think the issue is the originality of the work. That, you know, the more creativity and originality that the translator must bring to the work, the greater the role of being an author of the work is. So in nonfiction, you know, translators translate and they try to get it right and all of that, but it's not the same as someone translating poetry from Spanish into English, which is a much more involved and deeper, you know, creative process. So of course, you know, translators are also the authors of the book. You know, Jose's book has become my book. You know, I talk about my translation, my book, and all of that when I talk to my friends. I'm invested in the book. So I do see myself as the author. And I think that's the European way of looking at it, because in Europe, translators are very much seen as the authors. In the United States, sometimes publishers don't even want to put the name of the translator on the front of the book, because they see the translator more as someone for hire as opposed to a creator. Here in Canada, I think we're halfway between the European way of looking at things and the American way. So that's what I can say about authorship and translation, but I know you know this issue much more, and you know many translators, and maybe I should ask you the question, Beatriz, how do you see authorship and translation?
Oh, well, I mean, it's for another discussion. I mean, we could have a whole Zoom session for just that. But I think, well, the Literary Translators of Canada has always advocated for authorship of the translation, the recognition. So we've at the very least, the publisher should put the name of the author on the title page. But really, more and more, the names of the translators are on the covers of the books that we translate. So that shows that there is a great deal of responsibility, you know, that the translator brings to the transfer of the creation from one language to the target language. There's also the whole other another dimension of authorship and translation in Canada, and it has to do with funding. So that we can talk about differently, but certainly the person who translates a work of art, of literary art, has a lot of judgment to exercise and a lot of creativity to bring to the translation. And as you say, the better the source text, the better the creation of the translated book. I mean, you have to stay close to you have to be loyal to the content, but you also have to be aware of the literary culture that you're translating from, the literary culture you're translating into, as well as the social background, right? There are a lot of dimensions in that transfer. It's much more than just a linguistic exercise, yeah. So I think now we're gonna have a second reading, and we'll ask Jose to read a little bit in Spanish, and Ian's gonna read the translation of that same passage, but you have to both unmute yourselves, okay?
¿Qué es exactamente lo que te impide aceptar esta idea? ¿Sientes que dejas de ser chileno si comienzas a estudiar la historia de otro país? ¿Acaso pierdes tu identidad? Es algo así, respondí, pero va más allá, es algo difícil de expresar. Es como si cometiera un acto de deslealtad. ¿Deslealtad hacia qué? ¿A tus ideas políticas? ¿A la causa que perdimos el año 73? Eso ya no tiene vuelta, es un capítulo cerrado. ¿Hacia el socialismo? Ya nadie habla de eso. Ahora pedimos que vuelva la democracia, la misma que mirábamos con desprecio durante la Unidad Popular. Y mi amigo agregó, si no estás en Chile, no es por tu culpa, es porque no te dejan entrar a ese país. Y aunque lograras entrar de nuevo, ¿por qué es tan importante estudiar la historia de Chile? ¿Por qué quieres hacer tu tesis sobre un tema de historia de Chile? Y Marcos dice, cuando enseño historia de Chile o de Latinoamérica, siento que estoy permaneciendo fiel a una causa, que estoy contribuyendo a darla a conocer y a explicar sus problemas. Si dejo eso para convertirme en otro especialista de Quebec, eso es para mí un abandono. Es como volver a partir de Chile, alejarme cada vez más. Creo que para mí eso es un acto de deslealtad.
What exactly is it that prevents you from accepting the job? Do you feel that you would cease to be Chilean if you begin to study the history of another country, that you would lose your identity? Something like that, I replied. But it goes beyond that. It's something difficult to express. It's like committing an act of disloyalty. Disloyalty to what? To your political beliefs? To the cause we lost in 73? There's no return to that. It's a closed chapter. Towards socialism? Now we're asking for the return of democracy, the same democracy we looked down upon when the UP was in power. My friend said something true. I nodded in agreement. Alberto, realizing the effect of his words, continued. And if you're not there, it's not your fault. They won't let you into the country. And even if you manage to enter again, why is it so important to study the history of Chile? What are you going to contribute with that? I know that doing a thesis on things that happened in Chile in 1940 is not going to solve its current problems, but I can't reason like that. When I study a subject of history, I do it thinking that in the long term, it can help us to understand the country better. Through analyzing the subject of development, I will be able to demonstrate that some of the ideals we had are still valid. It's the task I've set out for myself. I don't know whether I should call it my mission. That may sound too dramatic or pretentious, but I feel that way. When I teach Latin American history, I feel that I'm remaining faithful to a cause, that I'm helping to make Latin America better known and its problems understood. If I leave that to become just another Quebec specialist, it's like abandoning Chile, like returning from there only to drift ever farther away. To me, it's an act of disloyalty.
Okay, well, thank you very much to both Jose and to Ian for the answering the questions and for reading such an engaging passage in both instances. So now we're going to open up the floor to you. So who wants to go first?
I'll go first.
Okay, Patricia.
Thank you. I'm very interested in knowing how do you feel, for instance, José Del Pozo, when you give everything to a person to translate what you want to do, what you want to tell to people. And to I and Thomas, how do you feel to be José Del Pozo?
How did I feel? Well, I felt great. I mean, I didn't know Ian, but when Silvia announced me that there would be a translation in English, I was so surprised because I didn't expect that at all. And so it was a complete surprise and a very pleasant one. So that to have someone, I didn't know Ian at all, but I learned that he's a writer. He has connections. He knows a lot of things and people in the cultural landscape. So that I felt great, and he worked so quickly and so well that well, of course, I made some corrections, some suggestions, but he did that in an incredibly short period of time. I think that he did all that because the novel has almost 300 pages, and in a couple of months it was done. So that it was incredible. No, I was completely happy and no problem at all.
So, Ian, how did you feel?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, I enjoyed this very much, and because I lived in Montreal the same period that Jose was talking about for much of the novel, and you know, I'm an English speaker, bilingual, from Vancouver originally, and I moved to Quebec, and Quebec has been my home other than living abroad for more than 40 years now. So I lived through the referenda. I know the English Canadians, the Francophone Canadians, and immigrant Canadians, and all of that. I know the politics of Quebec. And Jose's novel deals with those politics. And for Chile, I can't say I know the politics of Chile that well. I've been to Chile. I was there in 2001. You know, I study political science and political history. So I have a sense of that. But to be Jose, you know, the first time I met Jose was many months after the first draft of the novel. The first draft of the novel took 2 or 3 months. And then, of course, we had to fix it up. And we continued to fix right to the end. And we had a great Latin American book festival in Ottawa that Silvia organized. And that's the first time I met Jose, and we got along very well. I'm sure had we lived in Montreal at the same time and known each other when we lived there, we would have been the best of friends, you know, because we have a lot of things in common. So I think that's important. I think it's important. Jose's novel is very much a novel written by a man, you know, and for the translator to be a man, I'm a little younger than Jose, but, you know, not that many years younger. I think it's important because I think I can understand how to interpret Jose's voice into English, you know, and that perspective that he brings to the novel. So I'm happy with the result.
Okay, I ask you both this question because, for instance, when I have been translated, when my stories have been translated, I do think that translator do it better than I do. She's wonderful in the sense that she makes people feel in her language. So that's the question really, because when you do speak in English, it's different than when you speak in another language. You really, so that's why I ask you in the sense of how to feel the story of José Del Pozo in English so that I can feel what he's telling. You know, what is the strategy that you use to make people, Anglophone, know what the Latin American people feel? You know, is how do you use the language, your English, so that we could feel what Jose is trying to make us understand and read about his story.
So I think, Patricia, you have to ask this question in 1 year when we have lots of readers out there giving us feedback.
Hopefully.
Because we don't know. I mean, I don't know if we've done a good job, you know, in doing so. I hope so, you know. But I think I understood Jose's voice and the character developments. I understood the people he was trying to portray. And I think I was able to interpret and translate that into English to make it accessible to English speakers. But, you know, I'm still a very much an emerging translator. And perhaps, you know, a better translator could have caught it, done it even better. I don't know. We'll have to see what the readers think about it.
Es muy cortito, es un pequeño comentario. Le quería decir a José, cuando tú hablas de que hay dos maneras de leer tu novela, me pareció muy, muy acertado, ¿verdad? Pero yo casi te podría agregar tal vez una tercera manera de leer tu novela. ¿Y qué es lo que me sucedió a mí? Porque si bien es cierto, soy chilena, viví durante el golpe de Estado en Chile, yo llegué a Canadá de una manera diferente, tal vez, porque no veníamos como, digamos, llegamos con una beca para estudiar en la Universidad de British Columbia. When I came to Canada, I came as a student at the University of British Columbia. And my experience was fabulous. I lived at the university and we were people from all over the world. So I always had that curiosity to know, how did Chileans manage? How did they feel when they came and had to face a reality that is so different from the reality that I had to face? And I have to thank you, Jose, because that your novel really, really touched me. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So now it's your turn, Ramon, no? Or
sí.
Yeah.
Yes. First of all, yes, I think Camila gave a good indication. We're both Chilean as well as the author, José Del Pozo. But my experience, it's similar to Marcos, with the difference that I arrived in Ottawa, not in Montreal, yet the same mechanics, the same dynamics among the communities of exile is very similar. So reading that, the original version in Spanish, yes, I felt a lot of what a novel should be. I felt empathy, I felt identified in parts of it. And yet, one of the things that's important for Jose to clarify says, Marcon is not me. That is, it was only an excuse to get out of certain things, certain obsessions, would writers say, of to put it on paper. The lover of Quebecois descent is completely fictional, Jose, isn't it? Yes, the work of fiction, I'm sorry, I'm just kidding. But most writers would like to stay away from their novels and stuff. No, that's not me. Like José Del Pozo, come and tell me. I was writing my autobiography, and I find out that my biography is not very interesting. So I decided to give all this scenario and situation. Mm-hmm. It's a great novel. I briefly want to mention, thank you very much, Ian. I know a little bit of your hand in writing. So that's a very good warranty that the book that I'm going to read, after I read another one that I have, and I think you may know, Ian, the one I'm reading at the moment. But then I'm going to then be able to do the comparison of the translation to the original. And I think it's a great challenge because not only the idiomatic expression, but all of these idiosyncrasies of being Chileans and being in exile and trying to fit into different society. And I just want to close with a question to José Del Pozo. Will you continue writing fiction, or that's it? Thank you very much.
I would like to. I am a couple of subjects on mind, but my trouble is that at the same time, I am writing a book on history. And because my editor in Chile, I have published a lot of books on history in Chile. Some of them have been translated in French or in Portuguese. And in this moment, I am involved in an important project on history in Chile, so that I have to wait at least a year to think about the possibility of making fiction. But I have some subjects on mind. And certainly, I would like to.
My name is Connie McFarland. And I just want to congratulate the author, the translator, and also especially the publisher also. And even though I haven't read the novel yet, I will be getting it. But I have to say that whatever has been said today really resonates with me. First, as a publisher, because I publish, I'm the co-director of Guernica Editions, and for 40 years.
Sorry, you got cut off. Where are you? You're a publisher where?
Co-director of Guernica Editions.
Oh, Guernica, yes, of course, with Michael Mirola, yes.
That's right, yes. And for over 40 years, we have been publishing many books, especially of Italian Canadian authors who have written about the same themes as, similar to this book. And I have to say that we Italian Canadian authors seem to be getting a little jaded about the theme of immigration. So much so that at a webinar last week, a publisher of a magazine made the statement that I will not accept any articles on immigration anymore because I'm fed up with it, which I tried to make the case that, immigration is such a universal theme, and you have confirmed it in your, in your statements here, and I'm wondering whether you have received any reactions, especially from academics, who may think that the theme of immigration may be passé or has been done or overdone already.
Jose, the question is whether you have, you heard, right? I mean, it's hard to hear Connie, but the question is whether you have had any feedback about the theme of immigration among the academics who write about literature.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the comments of academics on my novel?
On the theme itself, on the theme of immigration.
No, well, actually, I live in Montreal, and this is a city in which migration is a subject eternal.
Yes.
And there's always place to more books on immigration, so that I think that what I could say is that there is no problem. I think, I am not sure, but I think that there will always be an editor for a good book on that kind of subject. I think so.
Yes.
I don't know what else can I say, but I would say that I am optimistic on that.
Yes, I agree with you. I was just referring because of the fact that I've heard many comments from Italian Canadian
I heard that,
academics that they feel that they are a little tired of this theme. But I fully agree with you that the theme of immigration, especially today, with what's going on in the world, is a very universal theme.
Oh, and also immigration changes so much.
It changes, that's right.
The experience of immigration is completely different now than it was even 2 or 3 years ago, or not to speak of 40 or 50 years ago. It's a completely different experience.
That's right. Every wave of immigration is different.
Yes.
I mean, it's similar in many ways, but it's also quite different. That's right.
So I don't know if we have any questions from the people in the actual meeting. Yes, but there's one also in the conversation, in the messaging. Yes, Gavin, you had a question, right? Oh yeah, that's you, right? You're a poet, right? Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, Ian and Jose. So like many a poet, I'm an aficionado of smut. The slang that Ian referred to actually caught my attention. So when you're translating slang, my question is, and it's mostly for Ian, but there's a part of it for Jose as well. How does one choose what slang in English is the true equivalent of the original? Because they are so different, slang being what it is, they're so different from each other in each of those languages. And then when that choice had been made by you, Ian, did you and Jose, did you discuss it and say, this isn't sufficient? The Spanish is significantly saltier. We need to look for something more colorful. Did that happen?
Well, we exchanged some mails with Ian about translation, but I don't recall too many discussions on the slang questions or things like that. There were perhaps 2 or 3 occasions in which I explained Ian that it should be translated in another way, but I don't recall that it was an issue, an important issue. I don't know whether Ian has another vision of that.
If I may say, I found because I read both versions, Jose's language to be extremely neutral. There isn't that much slang.
Yes, I agree with you.
there are a few very particular Chilean expressions or way of expressing specific situations that are very sui generis in Spanish. They don't exist in other Latin American Spanishes. But I'll let Ian talk because he's the translator.
So that is correct. The language is very neutral in Jose's book, and it's narrated by Marcos, who's an academic, and so he has this level of language. But there are many, I found there were quite a few Chilean expressions, maybe because of your background, Beatriz, and others, you may not think of these as being different, but compared to continental Spain, these are quite different expressions, and I had to do quite a bit of research to get to what the expression actually meant. And then for Gavin's question, since my purpose was to write for Canadian readers, native speakers of English, I chose the expressions that I would use in my childhood, in my life, and as opposed to choosing something that would be Americanism or something from the UK. So the language there is essentially Canadian English. And there was one expression, and I can't remember how it went in Spanish, but the basic idea was that there was the child Loreto, who had grandparents that were well off, and they were paying for this private clinic and all these type of things. And one of Marcos's friends said, well, this child is coming into the world with a type of bread. So I had to research that to figure out that this type of bread, this was a loaf of bread. This word meant a loaf of bread that you can buy in Santiago, Chile, and you don't really find in many different places. And then, of course, to say that the child came into the world with a loaf of bread doesn't work at all in English.
No.
I had to debate that about, and finally I think I settled on that it was the girl was born with a silver spoon in her mouth, which is an expression that we use in my generation. I'm not even sure if younger people in Canada will use that very much, but that was the closest. And I also work through French as well. So sometimes I compare the Spanish to the French, and then once, it's clear, then I go and I search for the English if I can't find it. So there were a number of expressions, and there was another expression which is for cops. Paco. Yeah, and I think that the Los Pacos, or as the Chileans would say, Lo Paco, that is probably only for Chile, maybe for Argentina. It's not an expression. If you said that in Spain, I don't think anyone would know what you were talking about. So it was more the Chilean expressions, and that's where I found a wealth of material on the internet, and learning about these expressions. And by the time it came to you, Jose, I think that I got those expressions translated correctly. And we were focused on other things in the translation that may have been needed adjusting. So yeah, so Gavin, it wasn't schmutty stuff. It wasn't that type of slang. It was things that people say in their everyday life, but is very much a Chilean expression.
But there's also a lot of cultural expressions that are particular to a specific time in the history of Chile, you know? Like the expression momio, which
yes.
is untranslatable, right? So you leave it in italics because it's not translatable. Yeah.
That's right. And then there were a few French expressions that we left in that came from the Quebecois because it just sounded better. Jose and I had this discussion about footnotes. Jose is a historian. I trained in history too. He wanted to footnote a lot of things. And I said, no, it's a novel. It has to read like a novel.
You were right.
And if we have to add more text in another sentence in the narrative, we'll do that, but no footnotes. And we came to an agreement on that. I don't know how you feel about footnotes, Beatriz, or other people in the audience, but in a novel, unless it's a historical novel, you know, I really don't like to see footnotes as a reader.
No, footnotes are not appropriate, but often translators will do a small translator's note, you know, to explain at the beginning or at the end, or maybe a little glossary at the end if there's a lot of content of that nature. But really, you're right, Ian. In this case, you resolved the expressions very successfully, and because it's not chock full of those expressions either, right? So yeah, you don't need much explaining. I mean, translation is not explaining, right? Especially fiction, right? You don't want to explain.
Right. You want to get people into the story and, you know, relating to the characters.
Yeah.
And if you throw a footnote in there, it's a distraction.
Yeah. Okay. So Silvia, I hand it over to you now.
Say thank you so much, Beatriz, for being a wonderful moderator. And I'd like to thank to Ian, because it was a wonderful experience too, and was a pleasure for me to work with you. And also thank you so much, Jose, for choosing Editorial Mapalé for your first novel. And something that was very good is that after a few months that we were talking, I learned that Jose did a big research about our publishing house. And he asked many people and people that published with us, and everybody gave good references. So I was feeling really good, you know. So thank you. And I would like to thank everybody that joined us today in this book launch, and everybody that asked questions. So say thank you so much, and I hope to see you in another literary event.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, thank you.